I just want to take you to one thing which I need to pick your brains on, because you've been asked this so often in the media, and I've seen all your interviews with this character, Piers Morgan, and so on. You inevitably, in most kind of right-leaning media, you are inevitably taken back to what transpired on October 7th. And the discourse has been presented, even in the mainstream media, and I don't know if we have time to share one particular issue. This character by the name of Dr. Phil. He was recently on his show, just recently had an interview with Netanyahu, but he presented the same idea of Hamas burning babies, decapitating babies, and so on. I've seen your response, and particularly the analogy that you've basically drawn with Nat Turner, which is a fantastic analogy, by the way, on that particular issue. But I was curious to know your specific response, particularly to outlets like the Electronic Intifada and the Intercept, which has in fact essentially called out the extremist Zionist atrocity propaganda. I mean, we obviously know there were no beheaded babies, but I mean, even the atrocity propaganda pertaining to rape, you have a situation where Yossi Landau, who's the head of the group called Zaka, he conceded in an interview with Al Jazeera that they were not children. When pressed with the idea of babies being burnt or being burnt in a crib, I mean, this narrative is still reaching out. My question to you is, in light of the New York Times article that Israel apparently knew about what was going to happen a year ago to the date of October 7th, do you possibly not view this, as opposed to viewing it as a blowback by, Hamas, but possibly as some kind of, at some level, a false flag operation? Or at least, I mean, we know Israel is engaged in false flag operations like Operation Lavon and so on. On that day, the security was not operational. It was as if Hamas and whoever was there was allowed to enter. Do you not see something far more deeper? I mean, Israel engaged and invoked the Hannibal Directive where they shot their own hostages. Do you not take that particular position as, do you not view that as a far more meaningful approach to adopt, as opposed to being in a position where we always have to be in the defense to say, look, this is a reality, this was coming, they've been kept in a concentration camp, whereas there's a more sinister element which involves Israel's direct involvement at some level?
There's no evidence for that, and I don't think we should go there.
What about the New York Times article, which spoke about the fact that Israel apparently knew about what was going to happen? They called it Operation Jericho.
Well, there are two things to say about that. Number one, the person who wrote the article, Mr. Bergman, he's basically an Israeli agent on the New York Times. Whether he's paid for it or not, to me, is beside the point. Roland Bergman basically is the Israeli agent along with Ms. Kirshner on the New York Times. Now, Israel obviously suffered a huge blow, not just public relations blow, but a shattering of its image on October 7th. Because Israel, up until that date, it still retained the reputation of being a kind of James Bond state writ large, with these high-tech commando operations which were supposed to awe the entire world. And suddenly on October 7th, its technical prowess, its James Bond-like image, was dealt a shattering blow. That being the case, Israel's capacity to terrorize the Arab world, what Israel calls its deterrence capacity, also suffered a huge blow, because it seemed as if, hey, Israel is not as invincible as we thought it was. So it's not altogether surprising that Roland Bergman would start writing these stories claiming, oh, we knew it all the time, because we're omniscient, we're all-knowing, we're the James Bond secret state that knows everything or at least that's the image they wanted to project with their high-tech prowess. So one possible interpretation of Ronan Bergman's article was that it was just an attempt by Israel to restore that shattered image of technical prowess, invincibility, and perfection. There's a second way to look at it is if you look at 9/11 in the United States,
Yeah.
there is no question there were 10,000 indications that Osama bin Laden would carry out an operation. But you have to remember when you're in the United States, you're getting tons and tons and tons of information about plots here, plots there, plots everywhere. And then the question is, how much value do you attach to this piece of information versus that piece? There were people, for sure, there were people in the Bush administration who saw it coming. One of them wrote a quite good book on the subject, the name I forget now, by one of the intelligence people. But he said they just didn't pay attention to it because
Yeah.
they have 10,000 reports and they didn't attach high priority to what, in retrospect, high priority should have been attached to. So it's quite possible that the Israelis, yes, some information crossed their desk that Hamas was going to do this and Hamas.
I just want to. I know time to you. You have to go shortly, but just one last point on that issue, and then we're going to move on. The reports in the Haaretz, the Times of Jerusalem, and 972 magazine about the fact that on October 7th, Israel invoked the Hannibal Directive and deliberately targeted hostages that were being taken away. And so you see a convoy and the people who were burnt. I mean, Mark Regev on MSNBC with Mahdi Hassan stated that they burnt people, but they were Hamas fighters. I don't know how you made the distinction. What's your take on that? That it wasn't crossfire killing, but they were deliberately targeting their own civilians.
Okay, my take is very simple. First of all, I did not look at any of the footage from October 7th. I'm telling you that. No, I haven't looked at anything from October 7th onwards. I've seen pictures, photographs. I've not watched any footage. I'm telling you that straight out. I've talked with many people, however, who have looked at the situation very closely. And the consensus is, number one, Hamas's intention on October 7th was to deliver a shattering blow to the status quo. That makes sense to me. Number two, Hamas targeted Israeli military facilities and intelligence facilities. That makes sense to me. Number three, Hamas intended to take hostages. It's unclear at this point whether it intended to take military hostages and civilian hostages or it intended to take only military hostages. Unclear. Number four, you may not like to hear it, but number four, they intended to carry out a civilian massacre, but we don't know the scale that they intended. What I would say in answer to your question is very, very simple. The numbers are, nobody seems to contest them at this point, 850 civilians were killed. Even if half, which I don't accept, but even if half were killed in friendly fire, that still leaves 400 civilians killed. And by any reckoning, 400 is a very large number. Let's be serious about it.
Yeah.
And it had to have been intentional. It couldn't have been 850 Israelis killed in crossfire or whatever, collateral damage, crossfire, whatever you want to call it. That's not plausible, in my opinion. Now, I acknowledge I didn't look at any of the footage. I don't believe a word that Israel says in the subject, and I don't believe a word that Hamas has to say in the subject. I disqualify both of them because too much interest So that's evidence with interest. I don't accept it. But people who are knowledgeable on the topic, and it seems to me completely plausible, those four items. I do not believe there was any systematic rape. I've written on the subject. If you look at Pramila Paten's report, even though that was supposed to vindicate the Israeli case, in fact, it did just the opposite. Because what Pramila Paten's report showed was they looked at 5,000 photographs. They looked at 50 hours of digital digital footage. They looked at the footage from the Hamas webcams. They looked at the CCTV footage. They looked at the traffic footage, and that area was right next to Gaza. So it was probably the most surveilled area in all of Israel. They looked at all the footage, and what did they discover? They could not find one image, not one image,